Lecture 3 of Biology 104, where we will discuss the origin of species. Speciation can be defined when one species splits off into two different species. Speciation events can explain both the diversity as well as the unity or similarity of life forms. Speciation events typically bridge microevolution and macroevolution, meaning that small adaptations that occur within a population or within a certain species can also evolve over time, over many groups of species. You may be surprised that there are many different ways that we can define a species. We can define a species biologically based on their inability to breed with each other. This is primarily used for organisms that involve sexual reproduction as their strategy. However, it does not include asexual organisms, and it is also limited to living organisms, meaning that it is difficult to classify fossil or prehistoric organisms based on this definition. We can also define a species morphologically. This is based on physical similarities that they may have. This classification can be used for both sexual and asexual reproducing organisms. This is also very useful when genetic analysis is not available, although many times morphological definitions of species are also supported by the genetic analyses. However, this can be subjective and it can also be misleading, as we've learned in the previous lectures. We can also define a species ecologically. This is based on the species and its interactions within its environment. This can also be used for sexual and asexual organisms. But with respect to this definition, it is not limited enough. We know that we can have gene flow between what we define as species, and this can cause complications with this classification system. These are only 3 ways to look at species. There are many other ways that we can also classify them. Many times the classification of a species may rely on 1 or 2 specific definitions. With respect to biological species, many biological species are reproductively isolated from each other. This occurs when biological factors prevent species from interbreeding, or from preventing them from producing viable, fertile offspring when they do reproduce. This can be due to prezygotic and postzygotic factors. Prezygotic factors occur prior to the formation of a zygote or prior to mating, and postzygotic factors occur after mating occurs. Prezygotic factors include things like habitat isolation, if populations are isolated due to a geographic barrier, temporal isolation, species are separated due to time, behavioral isolation, as well as mechanical and gametic isolation. Postzygotic factors include reduced hybrid viability and fertility, as well as hybrid breakdown over time. Habitat isolation occurs when 2 species rarely or never encounter each other due to some sort of geographic isolation. This occurs within the Ragulides genus. There are many fly species within this genus that live in the same area, but if you consider their habitat to be the actual resource their larvae develop on, they tend to be geographically isolated, such as the apple maggot fly choosing to lay its eggs in apples, whereas the blueberry maggot fly, Ragulides mendax, prefers to lay its eggs in blueberries. Because they choose different resources to lay their eggs on, they also mate near these resources as well. So as a result, they are geographically isolated even though they may inhabit the same area. Temporal isolation works when these species are separated by time. This can occur when species mate at different times of the year, different times of the day, or within different seasons. An example of this is western and eastern spotted skunks. Once again, these species live within the same area, but they mate at very different times of the year. Spilogale gracilis mates in late summer, while the eastern spotted skunk, Spilogale petoris, mates in late winter. Behavioral isolation can occur typically when species have elaborate courtship rituals. These courtship rituals are very important in mate selection, As a result, they're involved in preventing breeding between closely related species. An example of this is the blue-footed boobies. Mating with the female only occurs after the specific male high-step dance occurs. Mechanical isolation occurs when different individuals may have the ability to mate with each other, but they have morphological differences that prevent that mating from being successful. An example of this is snails within the Bradybiena genus. They may mate with each other, but their genitalia will not fit properly, and thus this will make the mating unsuccessful. Gametic isolation occurs when, once again, individuals of different species may be able to mate, but the sperm and egg are considered incompatible. A good example of this is mating in sea urchins. Many different species of sea urchins can release their gametes into a common area. However, proteins that are present on the surface of the egg limit and are very specific as to what type of sperm can actually bind to fertilize those eggs. We're now going to take a look at postzygotic factors. Remember, these are factors that come into play after a zygote has formed. One of these factors is reduced hybrid viability. Genes from parents between different species usually interact negatively to impact the hybrid's ability to survive. An example of this is looking at subspecies of salamanders within the Astana genus. Different species may be able to mate with each other, however, these hybrids do not develop properly or are very fragile and not very adaptable to their environment. Thus, they have a very low viability or survival rate. Another postzygotic factor is reduced hybrid fertility. Once again, this is when individuals from different species mate and produce a hybrid. However, this hybrid has no or reduced fertility. Many times this is due to some chromosomal differences between the parents. This means when the offspring undergoes the process of meiosis, it does not form proper gametes itself, thus preventing any further gene flow from the hybrid species. A good example of this is mating between a donkey and a horse. This produces a robust but completely infertile hinny. Another postzygotic factor is hybrid breakdown. This occurs when hybrids are indeed viable as well as fertile, but their subsequent generations are less viable or sterile. This example could be illustrated by looking at the accumulation of recessive mutant alleles in hybrid rice strains. As these generations continue, they produce smaller offspring as well as eventually producing sterile offspring.